also have the financial sector. I have never seen the financial sector move as quickly and as dramatically as we have seen them move in the past 2 years.
Christiana Figueres, the former executive secretary of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. She was a key negotiator of the Paris Climate Agreement in 2015. You can catch more of that interview on this week's Bloomberg Green episode. It is Earth Day today, and U.S. President Joe Biden is bringing together dozens of foreign leaders in a two-day virtual climate change summit. The event marks America's big return to the international climate stage and aims to drive more aggressive action to keep average temperatures from rising more than 1.5 degrees Celsius, a key tipping point. Joining us now is Bloomberg Green's Akshat Rathi. Akshat, thanks so much for joining us this morning. So tell us what we could expect from Biden today.
So we know that we expect him to announce two big targets. One is a 2050 target, a long-term one, where the U.S. Will aim to reach net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. But because the U.S. has also rejoined the Paris Agreement, it has to also declare a short-term target. What will it do by 2030? And that's the number everybody will be watching, because it's the number that the U.S. will then be compared against peers or allies on whether the U.S. is matching that number. And that number is expected to be about 50% reduction in emissions relative to 2005.
Well, where does that set them up? Where would their near-term target need to be? Let's say relative, if we talk about the US, relative to the UK, relative to the EU, because we know that they're all racing to shine, aren't they?
Yeah, now everybody wants to do more on climate, but also the numbers are the way they are shared, very confusing, because the US uses a baseline, which is a starting point from 2005, whereas the UK and the EU use a baseline that starts from 1990. So just for comparison, so that we are able to give the numbers that are comparable between all these countries, let's move the baseline that the US has from 2005 to 1990. And what we get is by 2030, the UK is saying a reduction of 68% on 1990. The EU is doing 55% reduction by 2030 relative to 1990, and the US number comes down to only 40% relative to 1990. So the US will be still behind the UK and the EU, but it is ahead of all the other major economies.
Akshat, it's a super critical point when you look at these headlines, because it is all about the baselines and where they stack up. Very briefly, what's the biggest challenge for the U.S. right now?
So the U.S. has had change in administrations, change in stance on the climate. The biggest credibility gap now is for the U.S. not just to set an ambitious target, but to actually execute on it. We know that the UK and the EU have now both legislated their goals that are going into 2050, and we've heard from Boris Johnson that even the 2035 goal will soon be legislated. The US, we don't see that legislation coming through because there isn't bipartisan agreement on climate change. But can Biden use what power he has with the small majority he has in the Senate to actually push through action that would lead to this goal? That's what the world will be looking for to judge U.S. credibility on this issue.
Akshat, thank you so much. Yeah, you're right. Actions and outcomes. Akshat Rathi, our guest on World Earth Day, coming up on the show. Building up to our interview, there's only one. It's Goldstein, it's Credit Suisse, it's Bloomberg.
Good morning. From Bloomberg's European headquarters, 6:30 a.m. in the city of London, I'm Anne-Marie Hordern with Manus Cranny live from Dubai. This is Daybreak Europe, and here's what you need to know. Credit Suisse posts a net loss of 252 million Swiss francs for the quarter, much less than expected. We'll hear from the man everyone is waiting to hear from, CEO Thomas Gottstein. Christine Lagarde will be pressured to reveal how much longer the euro area needs intense support to today's ECB press conference. And it's Earth Day, and President Biden is expected to unveil a new pledge on emissions as the United States gets back to the table. Manus, very good morning to you. There's really one story that is just going to be focused today across global Wall Street, and that is Credit Suisse. Unacceptable was the first line from the CEO regarding the Archegos, but Manus, net loss substantially less than what was expected. But to your point, there could potentially be more losses coming down the pipeline in the second quarter.
Yes, absolutely. And there is an MLive blog, which I'm just sort of trying to pull up in front of me at the moment. We've got all the editors involved in that. There's a couple of big issues. It's about what's going on with the underlying business, the wealth management business, what's going on in Asia. They have come to the market this morning. They're bolstering their capital. That's part of the narrative for Credit Suisse. We're also just seeing some of the top line numbers come through, Anne-Marie, in terms of the additional requirements from the regulator. The regulator is now going to launch legal proceedings. That's an additional headache for Mr. Gottstein to deal with this morning. And I think, Anne-Marie, it's a question of how is the business performing underneath enforcement proceedings from the regulator. Loan loss provision, 4.39 billion. The net loss in the quarter, 2.52 million, Anne-Marie, significantly less than the original tabled amount in the estimate, 760.4.
Something reassuring potentially, though, for investors, Manus, this morning. They're going to be restoring the dividend this year before they go back to buybacks. Yes. But when you look at the second quarter, they're talking about potentially a little bit more market activity slowing down. So that is something that potentially might just not affect Credit Suisse, but also European financials in general. But Manus, we have the interview today. Francine Lacroix will be speaking with Credit Suisse's CEO, Thomas Gottstein, and we'll bring you that interview right on the dot at 7 a.m. London time. You do not want to miss it. Joining us now, though, ahead of that interview is Ronnie Gose, Citi Head of Bank Research. Ronnie, just let's start with Credit Suisse. What's your first take on these results?
Sure. Thanks for having me on. The results obviously were trailed earlier this month, so we were expecting a bigger loss in the quarter given the events around that family office. So the results actually turned out to be slightly better than we had feared. There was an underlying pretty good performance in the investment bank. It was actually a great quarter for many investment banks. So that's the tragedy of what's happened around this family office that's pulled it to a loss. Absent that spectacular risk management failure, this would have been a really good quarter.
And just when we look at that wealth management beat, but the SEC are now looking at perhaps new measures on disclosure.